Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much, Peter, for your introduction. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Ngunnawal people, the traditional owners of this land, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. And also as Minister for Defence, I also pay my respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander men and women who have served our nation with such great distinction in times of both peace and in war. I sincerely thank Peter Jennings, the Executive Director of ASPI, for hosting this event here today. Peter and his team are critically important contributors to our national defence and also to our security dialogue. So, Peter, thank you very much. I also welcome my very good friend and my colleague, the Honourable Melissa Price, MP, Minister for Defence Industry. Melissa, as all of you know here, is an incredibly passionate and highly effective advocate for Australian defence industry. And also to the Secretary of Defence, Greg Moriarty, and the Chief of Defence Force, General Angus Campbell. I thank you both most sincerely for your leadership and also for the outstanding body of work your men and women have done on this package of material. And to all distinguished guests joining us here at ASPI and those viewing online here today, welcome and thank you very much for participating in this dialogue. Ladies and gentlemen, the Australian Defence Force of today is a highly professional and sophisticated force operating globally. It is also a force that continues to evolve as the world transforms and as our nation's outlook and also our priorities change. Today, Australia's strategic environment is complex, is increasingly contested and is also changing rapidly. Major power competition, militarisation, disruption and technological change and many other new threats are all making our region less safe. The 2016 Defence White Paper identified these trends and the profound consequences for Australia's economic and also for our strategic interests. And it also pointed to the risks to Australia's national interests, where other countries seek to advantage their own interests outside of the established rules-based order. An order that has been fundamental to regional stability and also has underwritten Australia's remarkable economic success. In 2016, the White Paper flagged a $195 billion investment in new defence capabilities over a decade. This is to ensure that Australia is best positioned for the long term to respond to these threats and also these trends. The integrated investment program that accompanied the White Paper and also the first principles review that followed it were and also remain the enablers of defence long-term investment strategies. These strategies are building generational defence capability, underpinning a far more potent ADF and an increasingly capable and also an increasingly vibrant sovereign Australian defence industry. The White Paper was also very clear that we needed to maintain our capability edge. We needed to adapt to rapidly changing strategic circumstances, and also we needed to prepare for the complex and high-tech conflicts of the future. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that future is now. And the government and Defence must respond. That's why last year the Department of Defence commenced a review of the strategic underpinnings of the 2016 White Paper. This review found that our security environment had deteriorated far more rapidly and in ways we could not have predicted just 4 years ago. Our region is now facing the most consequential strategic realignment since the end of World War II. Historically, defence planning had assumed a decades-long warning period for any major conventional attack against Australia. This is no longer valid. Defence thinking, strategy and planning have accordingly shifted gears. Right across the Indo-Pacific, countries are modernising their militaries and also increasing their preparedness for conflict. Nations in our region now have advanced capabilities such as submarines, next-generation air combat and highly capable land forces. New weapons and technologies, including hypersonic glide and long-range missiles, autonomous systems, space capabilities, AI and cyber. These have increased the range, the speed, the precision and lethality. Quite simply, they are transforming the characteristics of warfare. Nations are increasingly employing coercive tactics that fall below the threshold of armed conflict. Cyber attacks, foreign interference, and economic pressure seek to exploit the grey area between peace and war. In the grey zone, when the screws are tightened, influence becomes interference. Economic cooperation becomes coercion, and investment becomes entrapment. Transnational threats also remain: terrorism, violent extremism, organised crime, and people smuggling. The COVID-19 pandemic is still very much an active and a very unpredictable threat, one that is dramatically altering the global economic and also the global strategic landscape. All of these pressures are contributing to uncertainty and tension, raising the risk of military confrontation and also compromising free and open trade. Australia must be prepared for all of these strategic challenges. On my appointment as Minister for Defence, I set 3 priorities for the defence portfolio. The first was strategy, second was capability, and the third was reform. These are the pillars that underpin Defence's purpose and that will steer its success. The 2020 Defence Strategic Update and the 2024 Structure Plan, which were released yesterday, address the first 2 of these 3 priorities, that is strategy and capability. In relation to the third, reform, I'll simply say today that Defence must continue to adapt to meet Australia's changing strategic environment, keeping in constant alignment its strategy, its capability, and its resources. We must become more accountable and more financially transparent. Work to build on the First Principles review is underway within the department, and I'll be making further announcements on the direction of that third package of work later this year. The 2020 Defence Strategic Update is a very timely and detailed response to the demand of our constantly evolving defence environment. The companion 2024 Structure Update plan articulates what this will look like over the coming decade and, most importantly, what it will cost. Together, these 2 documents signal, and they also substantiate, Australia's resolve to pursue 3 new defence objectives: to shape, to deter, and to respond. Firstly, to shape our strategic environment. Secondly, to deter actions against Australia's interests. And thirdly, to respond with credible military force when we require it. Our updated strategy prioritises defence engagement in our region, the Indo-Pacific. This is where shaping is key. It is where we work even closer with our regional friends to ensure a stable, prosperous and rules-based region, one in which the sovereignty of all states, small and large, is respected. Over many years, I've personally been extensively involved in regional engagement efforts, particularly in democracy strengthening. Australia has an important role to play in shaping our strategic environment. This is unequivocally in Australia's national interest. And I'd like to make this important point. We must recognise and work in the knowledge that the US-China strategic relationship, the most consequential bilateral relationship in our region and in fact the world today, is increasingly characterised by competition. Australia has watched closely as China has actively sought to gain greater influence in the Indo-Pacific. We have supported China where that pursuit advances mutual interests in security, in prosperity and in stability. And where such actions have unsettled the stability of our region, we have joined with others in clearly expressing our concerns. We have always been consistent in raising concerns about developments that are inconsistent with international law or that may undermine the sovereignty of nations. We do so from a very steadfast position that our values are what define us as a nation. Maintenance of them is simply not negotiable. A zero-sum approach creates greater risk, and it also diminishes our ability to focus on shared prosperity. And I want to be clear, Australia remains committed to the careful management of our relationship with China. We strive for a mutually respectful, beneficial and productive relationship. One that assures the advancement of both Australia's security and also our economic interests. We want to work with both the United States and with China, and with all other partners to contribute to the stability and the prosperity of the entire Indo-Pacific. Evidence of our commitment to the region can be seen through Australia's long-standing partnership with ASEAN and our unwavering support for ASEAN's centrality. It is 46 years since Australia became ASEAN's first dialogue partner. Our South Pacific friendships and partnerships also continue to flourish. Together, we are ensuring our region remains strategically secure, economically stable, and politically sovereign. Our engagement is not defined through the narrow lens of strategic competition. We are continuing to strengthen cooperation with like-minded partners, including the United States, Japan, and India. The US continues to be a crucial force for stability and security in the Indo-Pacific. As part of our updated strategy, the ADF will maintain a capability to deploy further afield. However, it will only be done after careful assessment of both Australia's regional interests and also the impact of deployments on our regional interests. For decades, Australians have seen and we've admired our servicemen and women supporting recovery efforts in response to both domestic and regional natural disasters. Most recently, Defence has stepped up yet again to support the national response to the Black Summer bushfires and now the COVID-19 pandemic. In response, the government is enhancing the capability of the ADF to support both domestic and international disasters. But let me be very clear. This must be done without degrading the ADF's ability to cover and to deal with core military effects. So with this context in mind, let me talk more about our force structure. Australia is strengthening its cutting-edge defence force, which is already forward-looking, decisive and regionally focused. It is a defence force underpinned by Australian sovereign capability. And government has directed that Defence sharpen even further its capabilities, now across 5 domains: maritime, land, air, information and cyber, and also space. I've addressed how Australia will continue to work closely with our regional partners to achieve our shaping objective. Our capacity to deter and also to respond will be sharpened in many new ways. The ADF's weapon systems will be formidable, with more potent capabilities to deter and further distance adversaries' forces away from Australia. In this context, I think it is important to talk specifically about our acquisition of long-range strike weapons. Long-range strike capabilities mean our forces are able to pose a threat to potential adversary forces and infrastructure from greater distances. Possessing weapons of this type influences the decision-making of those who seek to threaten our national interests. This government's commitment is demonstrated with the decision yesterday to acquire the Advanced Maritime Strike Capability, the Long-Range Anti-Ship Missiles, or LRASM. We are focused on the protection of our deployed forces from ballistic missile threats, rather than the protection of the Australian continent. This is in line with our current threat assessment. Turning now to each of the 5 domains, focusing on key upfront investments. So firstly, our maritime capability. Australia is a maritime nation. Fundamental to our national security interests is a stable, rules-based order, one that permits the free flow of goods and services. This maritime domain is becoming increasingly contested. A range of advanced technologies, from hypersonic missiles to modern submarines, are being rapidly deployed. That's why the White Paper initiated the largest expansion and modernisation of the Royal Australian Navy since World War II. We now have an Australian continuous naval shipbuilding enterprise, as well as the infrastructure and workforce to support this. We've introduced new capabilities such as the Hobart-class air warfare destroyer and the LHDs. And we are in the process of designing and constructing future naval assets important to our deterrence capabilities. This includes the Hunter-class anti-submarine warfare frigates and also the attack-class submarines. Submarines are fundamentally important to our defence strategy. They are a unique and powerful deterrent to any adversary. They are critical to protecting our nation's security interests. Submarines secure Australia's strategic advantage through leading-edge surveillance and the protection of our maritime approaches. Our sophisticated level of interoperability with the United States is a critical aspect of our submarine operations in our region, as are our air warfare destroyers and also anti-submarine warfare frigates. Submarines are also the vanguard of strategic lethality and deterrence, with substantial firepower, with stealth, with endurance, and also with sustained presence. Our regionally superior Collins-class submarines are already very capably demonstrating all of these effects. We will see further refinements to our future attack-class submarines, ones that will strengthen our capability to maintain peace and security in our region. Our submarine capability underpins Australia's credibility and influence as a modern military power. And let me make that statement again. Our submarine capability underpins Australia's credibility and influence as a modern military power. This is not about politics. This is not about partisanship. This is about the security and about the future of our nation. The 2024 Structure Plan will deliver and enhance our maritime capability even further, with a total planned capability investment of $75 billion over the next decade. 23 different classes of Navy and Army maritime vessels are planned. Now in relation to land. The government will invest $55 billion over the next decade in capabilities to sharpen Army's lethality. We will also provide our land forces with enhanced mobility, speed, firepower, protection, and also situational awareness. Purchases such as long-range missile systems, enhanced missile systems, and upgrades to the protection, the weaponry, and the communication systems of our existing vehicle fleets, such as the Bushmaster and also the Hawkeye. We'll also leverage robotics, automation, and AI to enhance our land systems. This is to ensure the ADF can respond to a wider range of regional demands. To achieve that end, we will acquire capabilities such as new large landing craft, inshore patrol craft, and also uncrewed ground vehicles. These investments will enhance the capability of our land forces to conduct multifaceted operations, whether in conflict, crisis, or in cooperation. Now for our air capability. The White Paper made the case for a potent and technologically advanced air combat and strike capability, a fifth-generation air force. We now have Joint Strike Fighter and Growler electronic aircraft in the sky. Through the FSP, we'll be investing $65 billion, again over the next decade, so that our air capabilities deliver potency over even greater ranges. We will also be expanding our air combat capability with options that include long-range strike weapons, teaming vehicles, loitering munitions, and remotely piloted, semi-autonomous and autonomous aircraft. Our fleet of Growlers, C-130 transport aircraft and air-to-air refuelling aircraft will all be replaced at their end of life. The Jindalee operational radar network will be expanded to better monitor Australia's eastern approaches. And we will enhance our intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance capabilities. These capabilities, and many other in the FSP, are working together, will enable us to deter and to respond to attacks against Australia's interests. And also, they will better enable us to support our neighbours when needed. I now turn to the new domain of information and cyber. In addition to the physical air, maritime and land domains, Defence is increasingly focused on its capabilities in the information and the cyber grey zone. This new and broadening offensive is challenging our nation's sovereignty. Amongst the greatest of these threats is cyber attacks. With growing frequency, these attacks target all levels of Australian society: government, industry, political organisations, education, health, essential service providers and operators of other critical infrastructure. As I announced on Tuesday, the government is enhancing the ability of Defence and the Australian Signals Directorate to conduct defensive and offensive cyber operations. And this also includes increasing the number of our cyber operatives. Over the next decade in this domain alone, the government will invest $15 billion to improve network security and its resilience, to integrate intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance programs, to bolster signals and information sharing capabilities, and to improve joint command, control and also communication systems. In cyber warfare, there are no front lines. And given the blurred boundaries between military and civilian impacts in cyberspace, this investment will support the government's broader national cybersecurity agenda, which will be released later this year. And lastly, I turn to the new space domain. Space is increasingly critical to the ADF's warfighting effectiveness, particularly for real-time communications, situational awareness and rapid information delivery. Defence is working very closely with the United States, with the Australian Space Agency and a wide range of industry participants, all to advance its space capabilities. The government is investing $7 billion over the next decade on space capabilities. This will increase our self-resilience and also our self-reliance as we put new satellites into orbit as part of our sovereign controlled network. And we will develop Defence's satellite imagery, data processing and analytics capability, while expanding our geospatial intelligence workforce. To counter rapidly emerging space threats, we will invest in the Australian Defence Force's space control capabilities, such as space-based intelligence, surveillance and also reconnaissance. So, ladies and gentlemen, how do we bring all of this to fruition? Critical infrastructure and facilities, such as military bases, wharves, ports, air bases, training ranges, fuel and explosive ordnance infrastructure are all vital to deliver this. Military operations cannot be conducted and sustained without them. Recognising this, the government is also investing over $30 billion in the next decade to strengthen Defence's estate and infrastructure portfolio. Local industry involvement will be maximised through our Local Industry Capability Plan initiative. Since its announcement in August of 2017, this initiative alone has seen Defence let over 75%, that's 75% of subcontract work packages to local industry. And that represents a $1 billion investment. Adjustments to the Defence workforce will also be crucial to delivering on our agenda. Over the next 4 years, the government will increase the number of full-time ADF personnel by 800, and the Australian Public Service staff numbers will increase by 200. And a detailed longer-term workforce growth proposal will be considered by government in 2021. I want to emphasise also that the government's defence objectives go hand in hand with the Australian economic recovery and with creating Australian jobs. As part of Defence's forward agenda, Minister Price and I have prioritised Defence's collaboration with Australian industry. And we do that to build a resilient and internationally competitive sovereign defence industrial base. The massive global disturbance caused by the COVID-19 pandemic has further highlighted the need for Australia to build stronger and more resilient and more assured supply chains. Defence's industry policy will expand Australia's sovereign capability to strengthen supply chains and also to improve the ADF's agility. Defence directly employs 116,000 Australians in the Australian Defence Force and in the public service. If you take into account downstream and service suppliers, early analysis shows that government investment in defence capabilities already benefits over 15,000 Australian companies, employing directly and indirectly over 70,000 Australians, and this is growing rapidly. Through the Australian Industrial Capability Program, 10 sovereign industrial capability priorities have been identified. These will be developed or supported by Australian companies, and in turn will support Australia's sovereign industrial base. Critically importantly, particularly now, this means greater certainty for Australian industry, jobs for Australians, and better and more resilient capabilities for the ADF. And our defence capabilities are being further enhanced by targeted research. Research that brings together the distinct strengths of academia, of industry, and publicly funded research agencies to address some of our largest strategic challenges. Over the next decade, the government has allocated $3 billion of capability investment funding for defence innovation, science and technology. We'll also increase investment in the Next Generation Technologies Fund and also the Defence Innovation Hub. A capability acceleration fund will also be established by the middle of this decade. This is an investment of $130 million to support the intensive development of disruptive technologies. The government's investment in defence will continue to shore up our sovereign industrial capability and continue to grow jobs here in Australia. So where does this leave us fiscally? We are maintaining our policy of long-term certainty for defence funding that was first put in place in the 2016 White Paper. Defence and increasingly Australian defence industry rely on funding stability, especially during this incredibly challenging time for our nation's economy. Defence funding remains decoupled from GDP, avoiding the need to regularly adjust plans and purchases in response to GDP fluctuations. Total funding in capability investment over the next decade is now $270 billion. This compares to the $195 billion allocated in the White Paper. Let me assure you all that this expenditure has been rigorously cost modelled. Government has been provided with affordable capability, investment choices, which are all within Defence's current investment profile. We, of course, will continue to keep it under review. The ADS force structure needs to respond to our evolving strategic environment. And the government is working ever more closely with defence industry on any decisions that may be needed to trade off or divest capabilities to achieve our changing national security requirements. Today I've outlined the significant investment made on behalf of the Australian people into the defence and in the security of our nation. I'm very mindful that I'm a custodian of this investment. A key priority for me at my time as Minister has been greater transparency and greater clarity and greater consistency in expenditure numbers. I again thank the Department for this considerable body of work to make this transparency and clarity a reality in these documents. And I say to you all that these are numbers that you can hold me as the Minister accountable for. So, ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, we are in an incredibly dynamic time of our history. We face a post-COVID world that is more unstable, that is more dangerous, and is more vulnerable to the impacts of technological and economic disruption. Shifts in power and pressure on rules, on norms, on institutions are all endangering the global order as we know it. The objectives and the investments I have outlined today strengthen the ability of the ADF to deter and to respond to threats to Australian interests. They reinforce Australia's resolve to shape the security developments in our immediate region. and they sharpen the focus of defence resources to achieve these ends. The government will continue to work to ensure that we are positioned to respond to the challenges of today and also of tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Linda, shall I sit you on that one there? Okay. I'll just let the Minister get herself audio enabled. Are we live for sound with the Minister?
All good?
Yes, that's
Yep.
working.
Can you-
That's working well. Excellent, thank you. Thank you for that speech, Minister. It's, I think, perhaps best for us to start talking about some of these tectonic shifts that you have identified and the Prime Minister identified yesterday. We do indeed live in changeable times. What for you are some of the most significant shifts that we should be thinking about in our current context?
I think it's the reality that the world that we all grew up in is no more. And that is, to put it very bluntly, economically and security-wise, the post-World War II economic and security institutions that have defined our world and our lives are not what they were. And that is profoundly is impacting where we've gone with these documents and with this thinking over the last 12 months. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but the fact is our world is very different, and we have to define a new rules-based order and encourage very strongly all major state actors to accord with these rules, and most importantly to respect sovereignty.
Do you think there is a prospect that we can kind of reverse this, these accelerating negative trends? It's once the rules-based order starts to fray, it's a very difficult creature to sort of knit back together.
Yes, I do, but again, no one country can do it on their own. And so part of this document is an acknowledgement that we need to do more of our own heavy lifting, and we need to encourage others in our region to do more of their own heavy lifting, and not just to rely on a single nation to do that for them. One of the things that has most struck me in this job is that I knew that defence diplomacy was important before I took this role, but it is very clear to me now just how critically important our relationships are, not just in our near region, across the Indo-Pacific, but globally. Just to give you an idea of that, in the first few months I was Minister, I'd made 16 visits to international counterparts. I welcomed 6 here, and I've had well over 30 via video and virtually since then. It's the first time that, so it's not just us that are worried. As I said in my speech, and the Prime Minister has said, that it's not just us worried by the behaviours that we're now seeing in our region.
Yes.
Other regional friends are now coming out more consistently. But really significantly, if you have a look at last week, the Secretary-General of NATO came out and very strongly indicated an acknowledgement that what happens in our region now matters to NATO a lot, and as did the President of the EU. So that is shifting. We have to find a new way of working together. So whether it's, I look akin to a network of interrelationships with people who value what we value.
Reading the strategic update, is there just a hint in between the lines that the United States is perhaps less reliable than it once was as a partner for dealing with regional security threats?
No. Again, the document is very clear, and I've been very clear, that the United States is still the bedrock of peace and prosperity in our region, and it has been probably since World War II. But again, as I've said, no one nation could or should shoulder the majority of the responsibility for the rest of us. So in my time, and I'm sure that the CDF and the Secretary would acknowledge or agree with, our relationship with the United States, military to military, I think has never been stronger. certainly at my level with Mark Esper and with the Secretary and CDF's level, we have record levels of interoperability. Our training is becoming more sophisticated. The operations we do together is almost seamless.
Well, let's talk about some of the fun equipment decisions. LRASM, Long Range Anti-Ship Missile. Why LRASM? Why now? What can this do that's particularly relevant to Defence Force capabilities?
Well, as I said in the speech yesterday and today, we have made a very conscious decision for long-range strike missiles for all three services because for a number of reasons. First of all, with the increased militarisation in our region and the increasing accessibility of weapons and how they're technologically developing, they are now a threat. They are a threat to our deployed personnel. So we have decided this is the first acquisition for the Air Force that we're getting from the US Navy. We're starting training on them next year and will be at IOC by 2023. So this is the first to be on the Super Hornets. We'll roll them out to the JSF and have a look at what other acquisitions we do. But they are to defend our people, but also in acknowledgement that, as we know, launch platforms are coming closer and closer to Australia as well. So we have to understand the technology. And these are a very, very powerful deterrent.
And long-range strike for land forces, I've had a few people ask me questions about what that means.
Yes.
Perhaps you or CDF, what's in your mind for those capabilities?
Yeah.
Sure, Peter, thanks. That means that we need to study it very carefully. And it needs to be looked at within the suite of capabilities that a Defence Force has. But it's all about reach and either establishing or re-establishing that reach. So we will be studying it over the next couple of years to make recommendations to the Minister and Government.
So this is deployable capability, CDF. It's not about lining the beaches around the coastline or anything like that.
That's right. But let's have a look at it.
It's not, yes.
So CDF, let me ask you a different question. I actually was emailed by Tess Newton-Kane who wanted me to ask you about what does this policy document do for climate change? The Bowie Declaration in the Pacific identifies climate change as the biggest strategic threat in the region. And then I think very much connected to that is a sense of what the document talks about in terms of ADF assistance to wider civil authority, both domestically in Australia for disaster response, but also for international HIDR as well.
Sure. A really strong thread that connects this work with the 2016 white paper speaks to engagement, to partnership, to building communities of security in our region, and a deep Australian commitment to doing so and to being part of a community of nations. That is something that we have been doing very strongly in the Pacific with the step up over recent years, but something that we did and have done since the first humanitarian assistance disaster relief mission to Samoa and Tonga, 1919, 101 years ago. The Royal Australian Navy went to assist with an outbreak of Spanish influenza. So we've been in the region for more than 100 years and we are there as a member of a neighbourhood and continue to be so. The longer term issues for Australia and Australian national policy, defence being a part of that policy with regard to climate change, they will proceed nationally. What we can do in terms of the immediate opportunities that the Force Structure Plan presents to us is see those capabilities that have a natural dual use opportunity, whether they're rotary wing, the air mobility opportunities beyond the C-130J, Army watercraft, and the engineering effects that we and the Pacific and Southeast Asia have in combination. All these have and are and will continue to be used in response to the mitigating issues that might arise, wherever they arise, whether it's domestic or regional.
General, thank you. Secretary, $1 billion here, $1 billion there. Pretty soon you're talking a lot of money, and 570 odd million for the decade for defence as a whole, 270 million for capability. Is this all affordable in terms of what the document has set out within that envelope of funding?
Yeah. Peter, for the department, it's very important, and we very much appreciate the government's commitment to that very 10 years of a funding profile that allows us to do the planning that we need to do to bring these capabilities into being. It'll also allows us to give certainty to Australian business so that we can work with our business partners, and the government has now decided, as you know, that defence industry is a fundamental input to capability, and that's how we intend to approach our relationship with Australian business. So it allows us to build those relationships, let business know what capabilities want so that they can make the business decisions they need, the investment decisions to build sovereign capability for Australia. But as you know, that funding profile is set. And within that, we must deliver the capabilities that the government has directed us to. That means if there are pressures, we will need to do one of several things. We will need to go back to government and say, because of either the need for sovereign capability or because of complexity, because of workforce, we need to slow that down, push things to the right to allow us to deliver that capability for you. We can de-scope. We can ruthlessly prioritise what is important for government and to push off other capabilities. And that's what the integrated investment program allows us to do. It allows us to come to government with options and say, we need these sovereign capabilities, we need to develop our workforce, we want to build Australian industry, we can do it in this time, or we can't do it all within the funding envelope that you've given us. These are the options for us, for government to take about what it decides to prioritise and what it decides not to. And the prioritisation process is what has happened here, where we've done some work. Government has taken decisions about what its priorities are over the next 10 years, and we will now need to implement those priorities.
And Peter, from the government's perspective, that's why in these documents there is a lot of effort in transparency and also in the numbers, because as the Secretary has said, we're going to have to continue to keep making hard decisions about what we trade off, what we have to trade off, what we de-scope or what we discontinue. So we've been very transparent in these documents. So Australians need to know how we're spending their money.
Yeah. I mean, there are no easy choices
left
in terms of what can be de-scoped, and there are a lot of really necessary choices to be made in terms of things to be added to the strength of the Defence Force as we go forward. So this is going to be a really tough game to play, it seems to me. Speaking of tough questions, Minister, it is all about China, isn't it?
This is not about any single country, Peter, but it really is about our deteriorating geostrategic circumstances. Look, in relation to China, as I've said in my speech, we welcome their economic development. We welcome them as a responsible regional partner, but where behaviours are not consistent with the standards not only do we expect of ourselves, but we also expect of all other regional nations in terms of sovereign respect, in terms of, as you said, adherence to rules-based order, then we are calling that behaviour out.
I want to, perhaps if I can, quickly get all of you to offer some thoughts on Southeast Asia. You've all had deep experience of the region. Greg was ambassador in Jakarta. I mean, it seems to me that very much part of this document is the thought that we are going to be lifting our engagement with the region quite dramatically. We don't call it this, but it's a sort of Southeast Asian equivalent of the Pacific Step Up. We know that we have to do more. What's your thoughts on that? Perhaps, Angus, what does that mean in terms of ADF engagement? And Greg, maybe you could offer a few thoughts on Indonesia in particular.
So, very significant region, like perhaps the significant region for our future, and a region in which we have a very long and strong history of ties. An ASEAN partner nation now for 46 years. I think you'll see deeper connections at the personal level, at the level of exercise and development of interoperability, and a strengthening of understanding between the two countries at many levels, but in the military sense, a coming together of like mind on a range of security issues, and it's very promising. I've spoken to many of my colleagues in the region over the last few weeks and have been doing so throughout the COVID-19 experience. And we've got very strong relationships, and they're just going to continue to grow.
The Defence Cooperation Program is probably one of the most important programs our nation has to engage with our friends and our partners in the region. It is pretty much the jewel in the crown. Our defence personnel who are deployed in these positions right across the region have great relationships, great friendships with their counterparts, and my relationships with many of my regional counterparts again is critically important. People like Australians, they want to trade with us, they want to have defence relationships with us. And increasingly so in countries that we haven't traditionally had as strong a defence relationship as perhaps we should have, and most recently with India, with the CSP that's signed. We have had an exponential increase in military-to-military activities over the last 4 years with India, and that's continuing to grow. I'm now an interlocutor for India with Indonesia to start up a new trilateral maritime exercise series. So there's a lot of these minilaterals, multilaterals, and I think that's really the key for the future, is how we bring all of those together to support each other economically and also in terms of peace and prosperity and shaping the world we want to live in the Indo-Pacific.
I will ask Greg about Indonesia, but are you able to share with us in any of the comments that you might have had from your colleagues reacting to the strategic update?
I've had many comments. Some of them have been made publicly in their own nations and some of them privately to me. But I think it's safe to say that so far the response from regional partners has been incredibly strong, very, very strongly supportive.
Thank you. And Secretary, in Indonesia?
So, Peter, but first of all, the Indo-Pacific is core strategic geography for Australia, and that's why I think it's very appropriate that the government has identified the Indo-Pacific as the region in which we will focus our defence planning and build up our defence diplomacy and engagement. And in that, of course, Indonesia is a vital partner for us. I've been very, very pleased to see the way in which our defence engagement has strengthened over the last couple of years. A lot of that has to do with sort of the changing environment, the way in which we are having more strategic perceptions in common with Indonesia. But Indonesia, the prosperity of Indonesia, its unity, its strength is vitally important for us, but it's also vitally important for ASEAN. Because a strong and prosperous Indonesia means a strong and prosperous ASEAN. When Indonesia was going through a lot of internal turmoil many years ago after the Asian financial crisis, I think it was very evident that ASEAN lacked that sort of unity of purpose. And when Indonesia, as the largest member of ASEAN, when it has the confidence to bring that together, I think ASEAN is a stronger grouping when Indonesia feels confident about its place in the world.
And Indonesia was one of the first ASEAN countries to come out today very strongly backing our policy.
Thank you. CDF, I did want to ask you a question about the grey zone, which is now a much larger part of the sort of strategic lexicon of Australian defence thinking. And a number of people here, I'm sure, would recall about a year ago, the General gave a speech to an ASPI function about political warfare, which is really the same thing under a slightly different name. What is your sense of the role that the ADF can play in this grey zone challenge, which almost by definition is areas that is actually short of military conflict?
Peter, we see in the Force Structure Plan enhancements to things like intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance capability, and also to cyber capabilities of various forms. Those can give us awareness and give us opportunity in particular domains. But I would offer that much more importantly, if you want to both defend yourself and on occasions where your interests are engaged, seek to prosecute action in that ambiguous grey zone, you need to think like those who are becoming accustomed to employing grey zone tactics. Typically, that means thinking across all of the elements of national power that might be at play, and not necessarily responding like for like, but asking the question, how can cost be imposed on actions that are in breach of the rules-based order, violate international law, or are in some way diminishing or destabilising of regional security. So it's a first start with a very dynamic sense of how to think about the problem, look at all of the choices and options you have and the subtlety that might be required and the patience that will be required, and then ask the question with any particular element or object within the Defence Force or any other part of a government instrumentality, what can we do with it in the tactics applied, in the procedures employed? I think we have to think grey if we're to effectively respond to grey in the ways that are suitable for us and appropriate for the nature of our democracy and our values.
It's fascinating.
One of the most effective ways that we're doing that is taking the information that we have and sharing it, the old sunlight, and sharing it with regional friends who don't have the same capabilities we do, and actually showing them what's happening. Yeah. And they can take their own actions, but that is incredibly important.
Yes. Thank you.
And appreciated.
Let's take a couple of questions from the audience. I'll ask you to put your hand up and a person will come with a sanitised microphone for you. And let's... I'm going to go to Kim and then Michael at the back. So just behind, back row, Kim Bergman. And then we'll go to you, Michael.
Thank you very much for that. Kim Bergman from Asia Pacific Defence Reporter. COVID-19, I'm interested in, the Minister's assessment, but perhaps others, why you see it as a strategic risk, because once countries succeed in containing the virus and we all get used to washing our hands more frequently, won't life then return pretty much to as it was 6 months ago?
Well, Kim, I think we'd all like to share your optimistic assessment of the situation, but I think, sadly, that's not the case. Those of you would have heard the Prime Minister yesterday. He very deliberately made references and analogies to the 1930s, and he did that for a number of reasons. But the main one is that there are a lot of parallels. In the early 1930s, it was a post-pandemic world, which had been severely impacted by the pandemic. It was going through economic uncertainty. Rules-based order was certainly deteriorating, and there were great technological advances, particularly in aviation. So when you get a combination like that of circumstances, we hope that you're right. But there is no vaccine on the horizon yet. And as we know, there are certain actors who are making hay during this economic instability during the pandemic.
I saw one very credible report the other day suggesting perhaps 300,000 deaths in the US by the time of the presidential election. Michael.
Minister, you're now managing things on two very different timeframes. The first one is delivering those big long-term capability programs well over decades. But the second is the new urgency in the update, particularly around accelerated acquisition of advanced weapons and closing gaps in sustaining ADF military operations. And you spoke yesterday about accountability and reform. How are you going to use accountability and reform to drive this urgency and this rapid implementation that clearly you and the Prime Minister expect?
Well, Michael, that's a very good question, that one that goes fundamentally to the heart of what I do and what Melissa does. There's a number of parts to that. The first one is what we have in this documentation. You can't hold anyone to account for anything if you can't measure it, and that you can't actually hold someone accountable for deliverables. So that these documents are the first step in that. In the document itself, we've got 10 years, as you know, the 10 years funding certainty. Where we've actually gone into contract, we've got actual numbers. And they will not change. And if they do, that's what I've said, you hold me and you hold these two gentlemen to account for that in a more transparent way. We've also, in the handouts that you'll see that go with the two documents, we have unpacked the naval shipbuilding plan in a different time frame, so that very clearly you can now see, because there was some conflation between constant and outturned dollars and time frames, Whereas now what we've got is for those longer term, in this case the shipbuilding program, it is very, very clear how much of that money, so that's a bracket of funding into the late 2050s, is 163 to sort of the late 170s, but again over that time frame. So we're getting much better in defence. Through the first principles review, we've had a much more strategic centre, and we are providing more capability as a smarter customer within CASG, not only to reform their own processes and their own transparency, as you can see under the great leadership of Tony. So it is a journey, but in terms of how we go into contract, how we manage contracts, how we project management, and from my end, the political end, how do we make that transparent and accountable? And if we do have changes, how do we make that clearer why we have made the decisions to change, as we've done in this document? Because as you'll see, there are a lot of changes to the original IIP. So it comes down to, I think, project management 101, comes down to transparency and greater reporting, but also being very clear about your timeframes. And you're right, we're still going through the smart buyer process and how we do rapid acquisitions, how we do spiral acquisitions and project development. So it's a journey, but we are absolutely on the pathway.
Thank you. Now we'll have a strategic question from Professor Paul Dibb, and I'll finish with Catherine Zeising, if that's okay, Minister, after that. So, Paul.
Minister, given the importance of long-range strike missiles, which I endorse, by the way, to be able to attack an adversary, including the adversary's infrastructure, what are the prospects for local manufacture, given that what that would mean for greater self-reliance and sovereignty, particularly preparing for high-intensity conflict?
Well, there's two aspects to that, Paul. One is in relation to this particular capability, to the LRASM. We are acquiring them from the United States Navy because that is where the capability and that very high-end technology rests. Like with many other programs, wherever we can, we are now looking at how do we bring that IP and also the build and sustainment and maintenance here to Australia. We've done a very, very good job over the last sort of more than the term of our government, but actually increasing local sustainment, to the point with Collins now, that's over, I think, about 97%. So wherever possible, transferring the IP here where we can. The Joint Strike Fighter is another great example. Obviously, it's a foreign military sale, but again, we've got 50 companies in this global supply chain, $1.7 billion worth of industry here in Australia. So in relation to that capability, given we're just at the start of this process, we are doing this in partnership and with the United States Navy in this case, but we will look at that. But again, we have to be realistic about project by project, which ones we have to acquire overseas, whether in partnership, whether we're just getting them like off the shelf, or whether we're actually starting to look to develop the capability here.
Minister, I'd also note that Defence Science and Technology have been working with University of Queensland on hypersonic research for a number of years, and we can do science and technology in this country, as you know, Paul, and I think that there's a bright future for innovative Australian technology companies.
Yes.
Catherine, last question to you.
Hello, I'm on.
You're on.
Yay. Thank you very much for your insights this afternoon. I was very gladdened to hear about transparency and clarity, particularly from the Minister and the Secretary there. In that vein, is the IIP going to be updated publicly, since it's been 4 years now?
Well, I'm not sure, Catherine, how much more transparent we can be than we've been in these two documents. I think you've got more information and more certainty in terms of the numbers. And as I've said, this is a journey. Yes, we are looking at ways that we can keep more information out there. So yes, we are looking at ways we can do that. But I think what you've got in these two documents is a great start.
Well, colleagues, it's been a really fascinating hour, and Minister, CDF, Secretary, I want to thank you for taking the time. I've lived the joy myself of producing a number of these documents over the years, and I really do want to congratulate you for bringing something out which is substantive and timely and original in terms of the new directions that it's setting for the Defence Organisation and the Defence Force. That's great for us. It means we'll be in business for a long time, picking away at the strands of all of these things, finding the things that we disagree with as well as the things that we agree with. So I'm looking forward to mining this seam for some little time to come. But I want to thank you for your openness and for taking the time to be with us today. Can you please thank the Minister, Secretary, etc.